We are back on Left Reckoning. David Griscom, welcoming to the show Matt Karp. He's a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine and associate professor emphasizing 19th century history and politics. Matt Karp, welcome to the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
We were just saying off air, we're enjoying your background there. It's sort of like the geologic weekend update. Are you familiar with I think it's Pete Buttigieg had like a geologic map of. Anybody familiar with this?
Probably
No.
Norway. It must have been Norway, right?
I feel like it was Pennsylvania, but now I don't know why it would be Pennsylvania. But
not
who
sure.
knows? Maybe I'm mistaken.
I use this as the all-purpose, starting point for my, mineral prospecting throughout the globe, because we all know that this sort of like left Twitter personality business is gonna hit a wall sooner or later. So it's
on the
really all about
downturn.
raw minerals. Yeah, mostly copper and tungsten is what I'm interested in.
We've learned that oil's a safe business this past year, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Matt, we want to talk to you about your piece this edition of Jacobin. Now, we should just address how can you, as a leftist, write for a magazine that would glorify Joe Biden in such a way?
Outrageous. I was appalled. I sent Bhaskar a strongly worded letter of resignation as soon as I saw that print edition. Totally blindsided, Matt.
Yeah. People don't know Tim Pool was confused by that. Anyway, piece in here, politics of Second Gilded Age. Why the Gilded Age? Why do you want to bring that to us?
Hey, quickly on the cover, not to derail things, but it's funny that there was a little brouhaha about that, because I do feel like, and maybe we'll come to this as we move through the conversation, but like in the wake of the stimulus bill, there is a little bit of that tendency that's emerging, actually, totally unironically. So it would be interesting to talk about it. But yeah,
yes, we'll get to that under my section of material versus class politics that I want to get to. But,
cool.
Let's go into the elements of the Gilded Age. Why you want to bring that to people?
Yeah, because I mean, as I've said, there's no more viral decade than the 1880s, and as soon as you drop a historical analogy to the election of 1888, and it's like there's a prospect of Grover Cleveland being involved, people are just like lit. And so basically I'm trying to attract readers with this analogy. No, seriously, it actually came to me in some ways through, it's not and by any means an original comparison, in the sense that we've been talking about the Second Gilded Age, the New Gilded Age in political economy, in terms of, rampant inequality and,
oligarchy.
Exactly. Rampant inequality leading toward political oligarchy, in effect, with, there are a lot of, and to be honest, as a question of economics, in a lot of ways the current iteration of capitalism leaves a lot to be desired compared to the sort of heroic productivity of the Gilded Age, of the first Gilded Age, which was really, for all of its incredible violence and brutality, was building a kind of industrial capitalist infrastructure that, of enormous, like, lasting, consequence. Whereas I'm not entirely sure what the Silicon, real estate finance industry today is doing, of, what its accomplishments will look like 100 years from now, if they'll be at any way parallel. But okay, leaving that aside, the real meat of the analogy is it's just about the electoral politics. It's about, this was a previous era of politics where you had incredibly high turnout. And that's actually what got me there, as I was looking at the turnout figures this year, which I don't think have necessarily been fully appreciated in all conversations, how high these numbers were. Some of it is about the expansion of voting options because of Corona, but in other ways, you got this pandemic, you might think people would have stayed at home, and it's Biden versus Trump. I mean, on the left, we've been talking about how uninspiring this election was for months and months and months. And in fact, we had enormous turnout, and, something like, almost, high 60% in many states. It was well over 70%, 75%. And that's the Gilded Age looked like was an era in the late 19th century where you read about the election of say 1888 or 1880, and you don't see huge ideological significance in the debates. They talk about, they talk about material things. They talk about the tariff, talk about currency reform, but ultimately the two parties are not engaged in any kind of like really transformative project. Neither one. They're serving their constituencies, but that doesn't mean that the fact that there isn't much ideological distance between them doesn't mean that they don't fucking hate each other, because they do. And it doesn't mean that people in the 1880s, that average voters weren't politicized and polarized and engaged in the process. So you had this was the basis of the analogy. And I know it doesn't work like any historical analogy if you really drill down, but the idea is you have a polarized, motivated, highly organized electorate, engaged in the two-party system, which at the same time is really lacking any kind of serious class component, where there may be, as and I liked your distinction. I want to hear more about what this class versus politics versus material politics angle is. There may be some elements, there may be economic differences between the party, but there's no real differences in terms of, the balance of power of class forces in the society, because the Republicans in the 1880s, they drew on voters of a certain ethnocultural profile, regional, based on region, race, ethnic identity, religion. And the Democrats, same thing. And these were the passions that motivated voters. This is what brought people to the polling place. And while there were economic differences between the parties, the system didn't run on those differences. The system really ran, political scientists and historians, I think, largely agree, if you look at the coalitions, ran on this politics of cultural difference. And I do think that there are parallels to our situation today where, again, the parties aren't identical, but what really motivates voters in these coalitions, it seems to me, is increasingly a kind of partisan identity that is deeply connected to, to culture and race, region, suburban, rural, urban, et cetera. And is really decoupled from the 20th century politics, because I guess I should add that as another counterpoint. The politics of the long New Deal era, which in some ways went deep into the 1980s, 1990s. If you look at the coalitions, where there was a certain amount of class alignment, where the Democrats really were the party that, not all the workers voted for, but the party where 70% or even 65% of blue collar workers voted Democrat or higher in the New Deal, in the heroic period of the New Deal. And that has really petered out, specifically in the last 5-10 years. So I think the consequences are worth pondering. Anyway, that was a long.
Yeah, the high turnout thing is fascinating to me, and I'm curious what your sense of how that happens. How those is happening? Is there like a media, especially in the old Gilded Age previously, like how were the like serious issues in terms of like labor struggle going on? Did that cause the parties to go into these cultural issues? I'm just curious, like how that schism happens between, you're still turning people out, but they're not coming out for real stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because, so just to put on the history hat for a minute, this is a party system that emerged in the fires, the cauldron of the Civil War era. That's when the kind of these coalitions were generated in the 1850s, before the war, where the Republicans emerged as an anti-slavery party. And, issues of enormous ideological significance were on the ballot. Basically, the future of slavery in the world's largest slaveholding republic, which had, massive both material and class consequences, I think. And yet at the same time, drawing on an even older political system, there were cultural there were sort of cultural divergences with those coalitions where, the Whig Party and then the early Republican Party, I think, was defined by the Republican Party is defined by anti-slavery in its initial phase, but it still drew on, largely a sort of Northern Protestant, sort of small farmer, worker and sort of merchant tradesman constituency. And then, so you move through the Civil War era, you move through the Reconstruction era, the Republican Party stays broadly united around anti-slavery, pro-union, pro-Reconstruction politics. And then when that splinters in the 1870s, And now there have been some serious political economic changes. You do have the beginning of the rise of the sort of real industrial capitalism, and the rise of the sort of Gilded Age in economics. Railroads, factories, et cetera, are getting larger. The Republican Party becomes something closer to a party of capital as opposed to a party of free labor. And the sort of ideological commitment to Black civil rights and to sort of, the democratic project of Reconstruction diminishes. And then that's the setup into the Gilded Age. But the cultural fracture between the parties that was kind of on the back burner but existed through the 1850s and 60s and 70s becomes more prominent. And that's when, you have Republicans describe the Democrats as the party of, rum, Romanism, and the lash. Like, this is what the Democrats stand for: liquor, the Catholic Church, and slavery. And then, leaving Reconstruction behind, the association with the Democrats as this sort of party of the kind of, of the plantation South continues, but it's about a kind of identity politics, as in, you're a party of sort of like backward Southerners and drunks and benighted Catholics. It's not you're a party of plantation oligarchs, which was the Republican critique in the 1850s. Mm. So, you lose the class politics of anti-slavery were always a little ambiguous, and that's another question, but you lost whatever ambiguity was there. It basically almost completely died as sort of capital took over the Republican Party. And then on the Democratic side, to the extent that there were stirrings of a sort of a critique of Republicans as the party of big business. I mean, they were also the party of, Southern landowners, and the party of, a certain, wing of kind of merchant capital in the North. So their critique of the Republicans was based on, both on sort of like, government corruption and Yankee prudery. Those were the kind of main, hit points, rather than any sort of, sense of the Republicans being a party of ruling class domination. They both use that rhetoric. Both parties use that rhetoric. Both parties always want to present themselves as the ruling class, as the critics of the ruling class in a quasi-democratic society to get votes. But they both had their own robber barons. Each party had its own robber barons, just in a way not too different from today, where you have certain sectors, certain industries that are overwhelmingly, all the billionaires are Democrats, in tech. And then, in extractive industry, all the billionaires are Republicans.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, one, just how prevalent in American politics like regionalism is, especially in moments like you're describing, where like that class alignment starts to break down, right? Because you can replace, like, people have political energy, even if there aren't serious political material questions, being asked, right? They want to be cheering for their team. And what I like about your piece in particular is, one, the historical analogy, because it does work really well, because we are in a period of time where it is a great time to be an extremely wealthy person in the United States. Like, the ability to profit is extreme for those, in the top 10% right now in the society. But what I liked about your piece was that it also tried to pull us away from another analogy that people make a lot, which is the fascism analogy, which is a great way if you don't want to actually have political discussions to, shoot away, right? Because you describe it as a discipline tool, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm looking for, I just saw Corey Robbins said he's got an essay about this coming out, which I really trust him on this question. And I find, a lot of people, a lot of people I respect, it's not an argument that it's an argument that I'm willing to have, rather than an argument that, you sort of, want to dismiss. But at the same time, I find the function of that argument, both from liberals and from a certain kind of leftist, who sort of is like, to the barricades, actually obscures the complexity of the real political moment, and is just ultimately just, it's not that it's not that it's like necessarily so politically counterproductive, but it's really unenlightening, I think.
Well, yeah, I just want to say, like, when you turn it, I think it's more interesting when it's a question of elite political activity than when, like, you're talking about when it's let's be concerned about strain in the population that we need to distrust, basically.
Right. Right. No, exactly. And there are both liberal and left wing variants, if you will, of that version where it's like, okay, this X percentage of the population, has become functionally fascist, is basically ready to do mass murder against, against large sections of the population. I think for all of the evil in today, and I don't hesitate to use that word actually on today's right, I don't think that actually captures the balance of forces or the ideological endpoints of where what these people want. And I think it's a kind of, it ends up being a kind of, like I said, a Marvel Cinematic Universe version of politics where, you want to make yourself the hero. I mean, we hated it on the left when the neocons just beat the hell out of that metaphor in the war on terror. Every unfriendly Islamic government in the Middle East was Islamo-fascist and all this stuff. And, I don't think it works much better when you do it in domestic politics. It's like, you see the appeal of it, all those neocons who were so fired up about the fascism analogy in the Bush era. A lot of them were, they were former leftists and that's partly why they were keen on this idea, is that they had this, when you're lined up, when you can successfully label your enemy as fascist, it gives you a certain kind of juice that is useful to sort of mobilize and organize. But I don't think, if we're trying to do, any kind of sober analysis about the domestic politics of this country, I don't think that that's the situation.
Well, it's like that's the point that I was trying to make earlier. Is like it evacuates like the actual analysis, right? Because it just becomes a moral imperative that like something must be done, right?